Hello, ladies and gentlemen of biology. Welcome to your lecture on speciation today for this week's lesson. Before we get into it, I told you we'd be looking at an animal every week. The animal this week is a Siberian flying squirrel. You can find it in Russia, Finland, Estonia. If you're not sure where Estonia is, it's just south of Finland across the ocean a little bit, quick ferry ride, couple hours. As you can see, it's about the cutest animal that's ever existed. It is a flying squirrel, which I'm sure a lot of you know, they don't traditionally fly like birds do. They don't flap their wings, but they have these flaps of skin that when they extend them and they leap from branch to branch, it helps them guide. But as you can see, they're just about the cutest thing that's ever been. Let's talk about things from last week. First off, you guys are still doing great. You guys are getting work done. You're getting it done well, and you're getting it done on time. So I really appreciate it. Just keep on keeping on doing what you're doing. Natural selection and adaptations, just a couple things to reinforce based on the answers that I got from you guys last week that I want to make sure that we're really getting kind of the fine details here is we'll use the rock pocket mice as our example. Organisms, they do not choose to adapt. So the rock pocket mice, in the example that you guys looked at last week, when the environment changed with the lava flows coming through, the rock pocket mice didn't get to choose to have the adaptation to help them survive. They either had it or they didn't. Okay? Natural selection does not give them what they need. And so when the environment changed with the lava flows coming through, that didn't cause them to get the changes that they needed. They have the trait or they don't have the trait. So the variation is there or it's not. The ones with the advantage pass it on. And so it's a detail I want to make sure that we understand is that they can't choose to have the trait. The environment change doesn't give them the trait. They have it or they don't have it. And as the environment changes, what's an advantage in one environment may not be an advantage in the new environment. So classic example or kind of demonstration is 99 of species that have existed on this planet are expected to have gone extinct. That's a huge number. That's 99%, which you can read, obviously. Meaning that the reason species go extinct is because something has changed in their environment. Okay, usually the reason they go extinct, something's changed in the environment and they don't have the adaptations to help them survive. If they could choose to have the adaptations or the environment or natural selection gave them the adaptations, then you wouldn't see 99% of species going extinct over time. The only way that they have those adaptations is that if it's going to be in the genes through mutations, through reproduction getting passed on from generation to generation. Classic example, I've mentioned this before, Lamarck, he had early ideas about how animals changed over time. His suggestion was that giraffes originally had shorter necks, but because they needed longer necks due to maybe an environmental change such as drought, so trees just had leaves up in the higher branches, they would stretch out their necks because they needed to do this. Once they did, they would pass on that trait to their offspring, and so that's why giraffes now have longer necks. We now know it's more like Darwin. It's called the Darwin-Wallace view because there's also Wallace who was involved with the development of this idea of natural selection, is that there is this genetic difference, variation within a population of different neck lengths. In the environment, if a longer neck is more advantageous, which it may have been or must have been, those that had the longer necks would pass on the trait. Those that had the shorter necks would not necessarily. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no variation still within the population of giraffes, but overall, giraffes have longer necks, which is the trait they've passed on to their offspring. So this variation is there or it's not. They don't get to choose it. They don't get to get it just because they need it. Okay? So just a point I wanted to make from last week. Let's continue to talk about natural selection. There's three main ways that natural selection can go. You might want to jot down these graphs, getting kind of the general idea of what each means. The top graph, you're looking at an example population of mice with range, a fur color from light to dark gray, with most of them kind of in the middle, and then the white and the dark gray not being as common. Then you have a change in the environment causing a type of directional selection. Okay? That would be down here, the directional selection. So our original population, where most of the variation, or most of our population was here in the middle of the variation, is you've seen the population then move towards this direction, more towards the darker colored mice. This would be our rock pocket mice are a perfect example of directional selection, where you had the original population where the darker color wasn't as common, it was mostly this, but then the environment where the lava flow had come through, the darker coloration became the more common trait, and so you saw this directional shift from kind of the middle of the phenotypes of the traits over to one side or the other. Same could be said if it happened the other direction. That would still be directional selection. The next type, the one in the middle here, disruptive selection. As you can see, the middle trait has become the least common. Okay? So some environmental factor is causing this trait to not be very favorable, but the white trait is, the darker gray trait is. And so you see kind of a separation where now you have two of the population where this trait on the extreme and this trait on the extreme are the more common, or the one in the middle's gone down. Stabilizing selection, and this is a pretty common actually type of selection. Now you start to see the kind of the middle trait, the more average of the trait, become the most common. And so the two extremes are being less favored over time, and this middle trait is becoming the more common of the two. So those are different types of selection that you can see. You have the directional, where it's going one way or the other, away from kind of the middle trait. Disruptive, where the two extremes are becoming more common. Or stabilizing, where you're starting to really narrow in and just kind of the middle part of these traits. All right, let's review Darwin's 6 points. We had overproduction, making too many offspring. We had competition, all these offspring have to compete for resources. Variation, there's going to be variation within the population and the different types of traits that they have. Okay? These different variations are going to help them outcompete others of their species. And so these different variations that are more advantageous over time become adaptations within the population, which is essentially natural selection. And so over time, we see organisms becoming selected into their environment based on the traits that are more advantageous in that specific environment, which leads us to our last and 6th point, speciation, which is what we're talking about today. All right, with speciations, it's important that we understand what a species is. I know you guys have all heard the term before, but let's specify, kind of define what we're talking about here. A species is a population that can interbreed with each other, which means they can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. That means offspring that can survive, and then offspring that can reproduce some of their own. Now, one thing to talk about species is it's kind of a fluid definition, because we'll look at some examples where it's kind of hard to specify. Some of you might already be thinking of some examples in your head that that seem like they're different species, but can't interbreed. Okay? So what we're talking about with speciation is that's the process by which new species are going to form from original population. It could be 1 new species, 2 new species, 3 new species, etc. One thing to make sure that we note is that this is a continuous process that happens over time, often over millions of years. It's not something that it's just like a light switch that one day all of a sudden you have 2 new species from 1 original species, or there's just like one change that's big enough to make them different. It needs to happen over a long period of time, and there needs to be a buildup of adaptations that make it so that they will no longer interbreed with each other to make viable offspring. In order for this to happen, they need to be reproductively isolated, because if they're still reproducing with each other, they're still mixing their genes together, you're not going to get enough differences between 2 populations in order for them to become new species. And so when we're talking about reproductive isolation, and we'll go into some details here, they're the factors that cause a population to no longer interbreed with each other, or if they do, they can't make viable offspring that can survive and reproduce and make their own. Geographical isolation. So one way that this can happen, one way that organisms can be reproductively isolated, is if they're geographically isolated. So they can be separated due to a large barrier, like rivers, mountains, canyons, all listed on here. They can also be geographically isolated within the same area. So an example would be when you were looking at the rock pocket mice. Keep going back to this example, but that's the one you learned about last week. Is they were somewhat geographically isolated because some were living on the lava flows, some were living in the sandy area. So it doesn't have to be a big giant chasm like a canyon. It can be just living in different parts of the environment. One of the examples that you'll see today, or not today, whenever you get to it, but in this week, is lizards that live in different areas within the same island. So they're separated geographically both into islands, but also in different areas within those islands. A great example of geographic isolation is the Grand Canyon. If you've ever been there, you have noticed that it is a canyon and it is grand. It is a big, big canyon in the middle, it seems, of nowhere. Squirrels. So before the Grand Canyon formed, you had populations of squirrels. As the Grand Canyon formed, which took millions of years, the populations were separated from each other. You have now the kaibab squirrels that live on the south rim, and you have the Abert squirrels that live on the north rim. And if you're anything like me, it's driving you crazy that I put the south rim at the top and the north rim at the bottom, because in my mind, just the north rim should be on the top and the south should be on the bottom, but I do it that way. These populations of squirrels were separated by the formation of the canyon, and because there's different selective pressures causing natural selection on the north rim, and there's different selective pressures on the south rim, natural selection causes them to evolve independently. And so now they're different enough that if they were to come together, they don't reproduce with each other. Even if they could, they don't recognize each other as the same species anymore. Even though to you they might look similar, to them, they don't recognize each other as the same species. They won't interbreed with each other. And so they now are two different species of squirrels caused by the separation of the environment by the formation of the Grand Canyon. All right, behavioral isolation. And so this is another way that organisms become reproductively isolated from each other. They may be capable of interbreeding, but they won't, because they have different mating dances, they have different physical features that just tell them that they're different species, and so they will not interbreed. Examples are bird songs. So when you hear birds out there twittering in the morning, it's not just because they want to make pretty songs for you. It's because they're trying to attract mates. Different colorization, we'll look at an example there. There's mating dances, which we'll look at in a moment. First example, let's look at the blue-footed boobies. If you did not know, there are also red-footed boobies. They live in the same environment down in the Galapagos Islands, as an example. Blue-footed boobies, only the males have blue feet, and they do this funny little dance, which one is starting to do a little dance here. You can't really see it. If you're interested, look up blue-footed booby dance. They just kind of move their legs around and do this little dance for the ladies. This is unique to the blue-footed boobies. Okay, the red-footed boobies, they have different colored feet, and they do a different dance. And so females of the blue-footed booby species will not mate with the red-footed boobies because they don't recognize them as the same species due to the difference in colorations of feet and the different little dances that they do. We're going to watch a short little video here because this is one of my favorite little examples of reproductive dances. It's a bird called the mannequin. And I'll let them go ahead and tell you the story here.
Just ask this avian Casanova, the mannequin. There are over 50 species of this showy little bird, and they all go full out to court the ladies. At breeding time, the brightly colored males stake out a staging area called a lek, the bird equivalent of a singles bar. A branch serves as the dance floor. The act isn't all snazzy steps. Sound is just as important. The buzzes, whirs, and snaps may catch a lady's eye. But the noise also warns other males. Back off, she's mine.
So good example there of reproductive dances. You can see here, there's the blue-footed booby one. You might want to watch that later on. It's actually pretty cute. All right, let's continue on, talk about speciation. There's also something called temporal isolation that occurs. This is when two closely related species, again, they might be able to mate, but they won't because they mate different times in either throughout the year or maybe even different times throughout the day. So an example here is what's called the western spotted skunk. It reproduces during the fall time, okay? And then you have the eastern spotted skunk, which reproduces during the winter time. And so even though they might technically be able to breed, they don't breed at the same times of the year. And so because they're not mixing their gene pool, because one breeds in the fall, one breeds in the winter, they're becoming more and more different from each other. And so this is an example of speciation occurring in these skunk species, which also I think it's cute. We don't have these spotted skunks over on the West Coast. We just have the striped skunks, which I think are cute in their own right, but I think these skunks are really cute. All right, let's talk about these toads. You got American toads, they mate in early summer. Fowler's toads, they mate in late summer. Okay? This is an example of temporal isolation. Okay, so another example where they're not mating at the same time and so they won't reproduce with each other. All right, take a little break here and let's look at some animals. We got up here what is called a liger. You guys have probably heard of them before. Okay? We have what's called a beefalo. We have a cowalla. We have a pisley, okay, and we have a zorse. So I will tell you 4 of these are real. One of them is not. Can you guess which one is not? I know y'all know that the ligers are real. The cowalla is not a real animal, but you can have an interbreeding of a cow and a bison, which gives you the beefalo. You can have the breeding of the grizzly bear and the polar bear, which gives you a pisley. Also a zebra and a horse, which gives you a zorse. Now, all of these, though they may occur, usually do not occur in nature. They are either occur because animals are kept in reserves in the same area, and so they're in close proximity with each other, and so they'll interbreed, or because they were specifically bred together through either forced breeding or through artificial insemination to produce those. Exception is ligers. They'll occur sometimes in the wild in India where they live in close proximity to each other sometimes. Pisley bears sometimes occur in the wild. Zorses usually only occur when they're kept in an environment together, such as a reserve. Beefalos, they're pretty much produced by farmers that want to have beefalos. All right, so that continues on with where we're going to next is some organisms, some species are closely enough related that they still can and sometimes will reproduce, but what they produce are infertile. And so an example that I brought up earlier, I thought said some of you might be thinking about what I'm thinking about, is if you breed a horse with the donkey, okay, you get a mule. A mule itself is an infertile animal, so you can't make more mules by breeding more mules together. The only way to get your mule is to breed a horse and a donkey together. This works because they are closely related. They're still they're in a place in their speciation event that's pretty early on. Now, pretty early on also means within millions of years because we're talking about big time frames. Here you have, I think this would be the tigon, and this is a liger. I think a tigon is a male tiger and a female lion. A liger is a male lion and a female tiger. I know I got that part right. And so these are animals that, because they're closely related, they can reproduce, but what they produce is infertile offspring. And they have found that sometimes the ligers can be fertile if they reproduce not with another liger, but with either a lion or a tiger. And so this is an example where it's a little kind of fluid because they're closely enough related that they can still reproduce. Grizzly and polar bears, they get what's either called a growler or a pisley, depending on who you ask. This is an animal that's called a hybrid, and it is a cross of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. They don't occur all that often because their environments don't tend to overlap very often, but when they do overlap, they can reproduce and they will produce this offspring. From my research, is not necessarily known if a Growler or a Pisley bear is reproductively viable, if it can reproduce some of its own. Some of it says, some of the research I was looking at said that they can reproduce some of their own, but they are a little bit more frail than the grizzly bear or the polar bear on their own. All right, let's talk about some examples here. You got whales. They have distinct mating call that they sing during the mating season. A female of one whale species will only be attracted to male whales, which is hard to say, male whales, of the same species due to their mating song. So what would this be an example of? Think about it. If you said behavioral isolation, you are correct. All right, here we have the northern spotted owl and we have the Mexican spotted owl. You can see the habitat, the range of the northern spotted owl. You can see the range of the Mexican spotted owl. They are closely related species, but they do not interbreed because of their location. So what would this be an example of? Think about it. If you said geographic isolation, you are correct. Okay. So that takes us to where we need to be for talking about speciation, what it means. How it occurs. So go ahead from here if you'd like to move on to part 2 of your lesson. Make sure you take the quick check on this really quick. Continue on. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me via Schoology. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.